Hello and welcome from the Centre for Contemporary Art here in Derry Londonderry and our latest Roundtable podcast. Today's conversation is between three speakers brought together by Marie Farrington, Megan Macedo and Róisín O Meadhra. Marie is an artist and featured in CCA's exhibition Strata in 2024 alongside Dorothy Hunter and Amy Stephens, and Marie is also a CCA Research Associate. Marie's practice reflects on the act of making through geological and archaeological lenses, using casting, carving, and other sculptural processes. She engages with memory through situated encounters with landscape and architecture. Megan Macedo is a writer and facilitator from Derry. Her work explores the interconnection between identity, family systems, landscape, and memory, and is informed by her academic background in geology and the domestic experience of growing up during the Troubles. Róisín O Meadhra is an Irish artist and archaeology artefact illustrator. Finding inspiration from our collective cultural heritage past, her work seeks to create visual interpretations to reimagine artefacts through a contemporary lens. Her curiosity is also piqued by traditional techniques and natural processes of making paint and ink. And finally, to introduce Diagonal Acts, which is a multi-platform cross-site project by Marie Farrington, exploring boundaries of the body in the landscape from a variety of counter-topographical perspectives through a series of collaborations and unfolding public programmes. Beginning in 2025 at Cúnsmharáin Ócarim, Diagonal Acts aims to expand and elaborate on a hybrid practice of theatre archaeology and symmetries between stage presentations and fieldwork via shared interests in memory, partiality, fragment, trace and assemblage. This roundtable is made possible thanks to Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council, Garfield Weston Foundation and Jerwood Foundation. So, I want to start by asking Marie, what led you to invite your fellow roundtable speakers today, Megan and Róisín?
Thanks so much, Catherine. Thanks for having us all today. I suppose it's in the context of the project you just described, Diagonal Acts, which is a cross-site project that's underpinned by a range of collaborations, two of which are with Róisín and Megan. So I thought it would be a nice opportunity today to explore convergences between all of our interests and I suppose kind of unpick some of the different strands across the project together. And yeah, I was really drawn to both of their approaches to place. I think in terms of Róisín's work, it's her way to access space through specificity of objects and through materiality as well. And with Megan, her approach to place is through the lens of memory. And so I was really interested in how these two practitioners across different fields are dealing with some of the ideas that I'm trying to deal with as well. And as part of the project, Diagonal Acts, Róisín is collaborating on a series of technical drawings. They're archaeological illustrations of project artifacts or outcomes that are functioning as expanded documentation of the work. And Megan is collaborating on a series of texts that will unfold across the year-long project, exploring connections between landscape and memory.
How did you first encounter each other's work? Perhaps coming to Megan first of all.
I actually can't remember how I first discovered Marie. I discovered her on the internet somehow, maybe Instagram. I don't know. I heard her interviewed on a podcast. Her Instagram account, I was just so fascinated. I think at the time she was doing a residency with the geology department at Trinity, and just that, I have a geological background, academic background, and I was just so fascinated at the way she was using a geological lens. So then I just kind of started stalking her and started seeking out her work.
And to you, Róisín.
It's kind of a new area for me to be delving into, where I'm now finally combining my archaeology illustrating with my art practice. So Marie reached out to me last year or beginning of this year, and it's opened up a whole new world to me. Just seeing how Marie is viewing the world through that lens of combining archaeology and some of the thought processes involved in archaeology with her art practice has been fascinating. So it's really helping develop my own art practice as well at the same time, which is brilliant. Wasn't expecting that. Yeah.
I'd love to find out more about archaeological artifact illustration. Is it something that there's specific training for, or was it sort of a passion that became your pursuit?
Well, I come from a family of archaeologists. My aunt and my uncle would have been involved in the first excavation at Newgrange when they were in college in UCD. And I have an aunt who's an archaeologist in Sweden as well. And my sister is an archaeologist. So my background is always in art. And my sister was constantly saying, you should try this, you'll really love it. And I've always had an interest in our ancient past. And I was always trying to connect to that through painting and just painting images of people from our past, but it was never quite making that connection that I always wanted to make. And about 4 years ago, I started working with an archaeology company, just processing artifacts first, and then moved into illustrating the artifacts themselves. So when I started looking into it, then it really was a case of finding other illustrators and asking them for guidelines and for workshops if they had time or whatever, because there was no actual official training. They touch on it, I think, for a little bit in college, but there's no actual course that you do in archaeology illustrating. But my background is also in architecture as well, so I'd have a lot of technical drafting skills anyway. So they all combined with my art experience through college and through life, where you're doing pottery courses and printmaking. All these learning opportunities that I've had feed into illustrating an artifact, because the main thing you're looking for in an artifact is trying to find the information as to how it was made, and also any marks made by the human hand on the object, either through use or wear, but mainly the construction process, if you can kind of decipher that from the artifact as well. Now, it is always sent to a specialist and they're the ultimate, but when you're sitting and drawing an object all the time, and you're spending so much time sitting with an object, you really start to see tiny, minute details in it, and you understand how it was put together. So it's a fascinating process. But, well, I think in England, they might have more courses now in archaeology illustrating, but certainly in Ireland, there isn't, no.
And is there sort of an ethical component to that as to what you're choosing to highlight or emphasize? Or is it, a real careful consideration to be purely representational? How does it work?
So yes, your drawing is, firstly, if it's a small artifact, then you're drawing 1-to-1 scale, first of all. Any bigger, then you're scaling it down. So the sizing is very accurate in the scale. And then the detailing placement, it's all very, very accurate, because really what you're doing with these illustrations is once the artifact is been through the whole post-excavation process and then deposited with the museum, it's put into storage unless they're going to use it for an exhibition. So these drawings are used in reports for specialists. So they really have to be an accurate interpretation of the artifact itself. So you are guided by some specialist reports if you have them. If they've already identified certain detail that they deem significant, you're going to highlight that more than, say, just the smooth surface of, say, a pottery sherd. You'll highlight more where maybe twisted rope was pressed into the pottery when it was wet. And that's kind of the interest there, because decorations might then indicate certain areas where the shirt is from, or marked by the maker, so they're the important features then that you're going to have more highlighted in the drawings. It is really for pulling out specific information then as requested by specialists.
It sounds to be a really interesting counterpoint to, Marie, your practice, where there's that element of chance and the behaviour of the nature of materials that influences some of the outcomes of your works. For example, the castings that we had here at Strata, where you were casting plumb lines, and there's the sort of, I'm trying to think of a word that isn't splodge, but I'm sticking with splodge.
What is good?
So can you talk about how you approach accuracy and chance and how that works within your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an interesting tension, particularly in casting, between control and then the agency of the material. And I find I often reach a point, almost always, where control swaps to the material and away from me. So I'm open to happenstance and the material kind of finding its own form, whether it's plaster or glass or ceramics or whatever it is that I'm working with. But I'm really interested in the differences in materials and their behaviors, like working with metal compared to working with something like glass. There's such a different level of cooperation with the material. But I think what I loved so much about Róisín's work, and what really drew me to approach Róisín, was this idea of archaeological illustration as a very generous and expansive way to document an object. Because I was working with Fiona Hallinan, who was my research advisor at the early part of this project, and she was telling me about archaeological illustration as offering more visual information than a photograph. And I found that a bit mind-blowing. I couldn't get my head around that until I saw Róisín's work in her archaeological portfolio, and then it made complete sense because there's such an incredible, it feels almost like a psychic insight into the history of the object that comes through this drawing process. And at one point, me and Róisín were chatting, and she was able to speak back to me how I had made this particular anthracite bowl, and I was just floored by how accurate she was. It was just like she was there in the room when I was making it. So I think there's a real kind of sculptural gaze to archaeological illustration that I think is really, really rich.
I'd love to know a bit more about how you make an anthracite bowl. Can you talk us through the process?
Yeah, I'm not sure if my process is the official process. Probably it's definitely not. But at the time, I had a couple of different molds that I was working from that were just bowl shaped. I think I had round ones and oval ones. The one in question with Róisín was round, but I was pressing the clay against the inside of this round mold. And I had lined it with, I think it was just cling film, but I was, after collecting lots of different little pieces of anthracite clay, I was making something else. And all the little pieces I pulled off and cast aside, I had collected them in a pile. So I was making this bowl from all these little fragments of leftover clay, pressing them against the side of this mold. And yeah, they were just accumulating together. And then I smoothed them all together. But of course, then on the outside, the part that was in contact with the mold, the little joins and separations were all visible. And yeah, Róisín was able to tell me that I had pressed it against a form and that there was a plastic interface in between. And even more than that, like it was just really an amazing window into the making process because there was that kind of removal, but also the intimacy as well.
And something about your practice, Marie, is the way that you're choosing your materials and the relationship to both land and identity. And that's something I definitely want to ask Megan about in a moment. But Marie, what informs your decision of material?
I suppose first and foremost, I'm really drawn to the associative capacity of material. I've worked with a wide range of substances over the years. I did a lot of work in plaster in the past, and that was kind of the beginning of my relationship with casting. Now I'm interested in materials like wax and metal and kind of combining those two things and allowing them to speak to each other. I'm interested in the conversations that develop between materials, how they relax in the space or how they kind of change form slightly under different lighting conditions or heating conditions. So I'm interested in, I suppose, the historical resonance to some extent, as well as just the tactile way that materials kind of crystallize when they're put together, both in the studio and the space. And I'm always really interested in how things behave in the studio and then how they behave when they're formalized in an institution or in a context of display.
Yeah, there's definitely something, as from my position as curating exhibitions, of that kind of magic or discomfort when something is transported from the artist studio into whatever, whether it's offsite, whether it's in, a classic white cube, but how things change and how you can see things that you couldn't see otherwise sometimes, or what can get lost and how to mitigate that.
Yeah, totally. And one thing I was realizing, like as I was presenting work, it would come back to the studio, and oftentimes I would start to rework it or repurpose the materials. And it just made me realize that the finality of an object in the gallery, it doesn't really have to be that way. And over time, I've started to work in this more iterative format, and particularly with this project with diagonal acts, where objects are kind of just on pause when they're in the gallery, but then they're open to being reworked and for a new relationship to emerge with them in the studio again. And so I think in this project, as I work across the multiple sites, I'm presenting distinct bodies of work, but there is a lot of interrelation and reworking of objects and materials.
Definitely want to come back to more questions about this. And I want to ask Megan, so landscape and identity, that's something that I believe is coming through your interests. Can you tell us a bit about how those interconnect in your work?
For me, landscape and identity are completely interlinked. So my personal experience of it is I grew up in Derry, but with grandparents from Donegal. And so I kind of grew up straddling Derry and Donegal. And so the landscape of the coast of Donegal, I kind of don't see a distinction between my inner landscape and the external landscape in a way. I think that especially if you're rooted in a place, the experience that you have of the landscape is so formative. Like, it informs the way that we think, it informs the metaphors that we use to understand ourselves, it informs the language of the community that we grew up in. Like, the landscape is baked into all of it. And so there's something for me about the landscape then kind of becomes a portal for access and parts of our internal landscape that otherwise are very difficult to get access to. And, you know, I went on to study geology, not consciously connecting those two things. It took me a long time to consciously connect those two things. But the interest in geology is about an interest in history, really. It's an interest in the question, what happened here? And if we can understand the rocks, we can understand the context into which we were born. And I'm just very aware of, you know, none of us are really individuals. We're all inheritors of a particular tradition. That, you know, I'm so fascinated to hear, Róisín, that you come from a family of archaeologists. I didn't know that families of archaeologists existed, but now it's my favorite thing. We inherit so much. You know, we come from cultures and communities that hold questions, families that hold questions, and the landscape is just, to me, such a naturally integrated part of that context. So if we want to understand personal identity, we have to understand cultural identity, and we have to understand the landscape in which those identities were formed.
Is that something that you both resonate with, Marie and Róisín? I say in a very leading way.
Absolutely, yes. I think across the conversations I've had with Megan, this idea kind of permeates that of landscape as a kind of access point for, I suppose, a collective memory, a personal memory. And yeah, I think it's really incredible to see Megan's approach to the kind of historical landscapes of her life and how she uses such minute detail to open up such universal kind of ideas around experiences of place.
Yeah, I think as well, for me, just that idea that the landscape is the overarching thing that's encompassing our history as the human race. So, you know, that's where we find all the artifacts, that's where we find the histories of time is all held within the landscape. So it's just like this big band-aid that keeps covering over and just our collective past, really. And I think that feeling that you're always tied to the land then, because that's where your history is as well, is just, it's very strong for me as well. So I do, Megan, I love that connection idea with the landscape. Definitely. I would feel it too.
And I think for me, geology and archaeology are almost the same thing. Like, whenever I was a kid, I used to go to Donegal, and out the back of the cottage, which, you know, was my great grandparents originally, I would just be digging around out the back, and there would always be crockery, and I would bring it in and put it up and demanding that someone tell me something about was this thing that I have found and who did it belong to and where did it come from. And that's just like the top layer of geological exploration. You know, we can go deeper down into the rocks and find out about further and further back, but it's the same kind of process. There's always this inference happening, and there's always this tension that you both have been talking about as well, of what is uncertain and what is accurate. And it's a constant jigsaw piece. We have to infer everything. Like, geology in that sense is parts of it are a very hard science, but then there's an art to the interpretation of what did happen here and how do we look at it. And Marie, the process that you were describing earlier of where you take work back from an exhibition and you rework it or you repurpose it is a geological process. Like, that is how the rock cycle works. There is no complete record of the rock record anywhere in the world because it's constantly in flux. So the old rocks have to surrender themselves, they have to erode, they have to, you know, subduct and melt, they have to give themselves up so that we can have new rocks. So the way that you talk about your work and the way that you willingly do that in your work, I think is so fascinating.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think we really are just seeing like a snapshot of a moment in geology, even though it's across, you know, so many eons. But I think, yeah, it's really interesting to think about all of our own practices, the three of us, as being so analogous with excavating in different ways, like different ways of uncovering or unearthing through writing or through drawing or through sculpture.
I think what's nice, Marie, about, again, because that caught my attention, is that, you know, you're taking back what you put out in your exhibitions, and then they're becoming part of a news story. And I think that's lovely. That's carrying on that continuous developing through time as well. So exhibition that you're still now many years later maybe repurposing or reusing something from that. So there's this holding of this story through time as well, which I love. It's just really special, I think, as well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think like with the project across the different sites, because it's at Cunsrine Aughrim and then the Dock and then Commonage in London, with workshops in Temple Bar Gallery and Studios as well. But I think what's been really important for me in terms of what you've just described, that kind of continuous line, is working in like acts or iterations. Thinking about my project like that has been really helpful and something that's emerged kind of over the last couple of years in how I work, because it provides a framework for presentations that are kind of unfixed or process led. Yeah, thinking about my output in that way enables me to imagine the wider arc of the project as a kind of sculptural entity in itself, with pieces able to be added on or pulled out or reshaped. Yeah.
Something that has struck me since I've been living in this part of the world is the presence of the very old rocks and the carvings, the megalithic, the different, whether it's standing stones or those spirals. They're so evocative, and I see how they influence contemporary culture in terms of artistic practice and what is created, but also in literature as well. Just that real connection to the old presence of human on the landscape and pre-human landscape that surrounds us, as well as what's happening with contemporary landscape and different, almost like scarring, whether it's the sort of scars and fissures from the recent mica crisis and the peat cutting as well. I just wanted to ask if that's something that, or how you approach that sort of contemporary landscape and the very old landscape in your work.
Such an interesting question. I don't know if this is going to be an answer to your question, but this is how I think about it. So I am really interested in the idea of a geological present moment. You know, if we say now as humans, if I say now to you, I might be talking about this second, this minute, this hour, today, this month. But when we say now in a geological sense, the smallest unit of geological time is an age, which is at minimum tens of thousands of years. And so to me, in the geological present moment, everything makes sense. As soon as I kind of try to zoom into human scale and human time, things start to get very messy and complicated and disjointed, because we can think of like, you know, this is a present moment, but actually the context is so important, and the present moment to me doesn't make sense unless we're looking at the geological present moment, which involves the old history, the old people. And it's one of the things that I like about the landscape. So one of the artifacts that we have in my family is my grandfather was a hobby photographer. So we have some of his photographs. And if you look at photographs of Donegal from the 50s, probably the photographs are from, there's so many photographs of just my family members, some of them I never met, in the landscape. And if I look at a photograph today, I can go to that exact point in the landscape. Like the landscape is so familiar to me and it's unchanged. And there's something about going back to these places along the coastline in North Donegal, Northwest Donegal, and thinking about the fact that not just my great-great-grandparents, but, you know, back hundreds, thousands of years, it's kind of like, oh, we all live in the same house. The landscape is completely unchanged. And so then the idea of what is contemporary becomes very murky. It's like all of a sudden the stone carvings are contemporary. They're very, in a geological sense, like they're brand new. And so I'm always thinking about all of these things at the same time. Like there is this sense that, you know, those generations, the ghosts of the past, like we're all here in the same moment.
Megan, I have to just comment there, but that's really fascinating, because one thing that that always goes through my mind is when an artifact is discovered, just for that split second when it's discovered initially, that the front surface of the artifact is now existing in the present moment in time, but the back of it is still sitting exactly where it was deposited last. So it's like, between your concept and mine, the land is like the common denominator that's always connecting us to the present and the past. And I just get chills thinking about that. A shiver down the spine now. But No, I love that of your interpreting that when you can go to the exact spot and stand exactly where they stood, you're touching that moment in time with them where you stand together through the land as well. It's just, great.
Yeah, I love that. And something that Marie has talked about and explored in her work is, the idea of surfaces holding memory and traces and all of that. And that is very much the experience that I have. Like, there are certain photographs where I can see family members, grandparents with their, sitting on a rock or their hand on a rock, and I can go to that exact same rock and put my hand in exactly the same place, or rest my body in exactly the same place. And the surface of most of the rock around the coast of Donegal has lichen on it, and lichen is a living thing, like just about a living thing, but a living thing. And so there is then this idea that, like, well, actually the surface of the rock, we think of rock as this non-living thing, but to me it's a very living thing, and the surface of the rock is alive. So yeah, I love the way that, Marie, you explore that idea in your work of, surfaces as a repository of memory.
Yeah, I think surface is such an interesting topic. I think you could have a whole other conversation about that idea. Like, yeah, I became really interested in surface as this point of intersection between the history and the future of an object. And it's this kind of really heightened kind of point of contact between the thing and the world. I think the idea of surface as well, there's a kind of an imagehood to it, even though we're talking about an object. There's a kind of relationship to flatness, or to almost like the pictorial index of a thing, that I think is really interesting as well. Yeah, like the act of kind of flattening a thing down, kind of creating an image of its surface. I think there's something really interesting there. And I know, like, geological and I think archaeological sampling methods sometimes do that, where they'll like take a slice of an object. And I think to see something kind of reduced to a flat pictorial plane, yeah, it's just such a different kind of perspective on a three-dimensional object. And it's a way to kind of, read time into it, I think, a really interesting way.
Sort of reminded of a couple of things. In one way, being transported back to A-level geography with the very crude diagrams to explore things, and the ideas of denudation. And I remember we were sort of told that the Earth is constantly wanting to flatten, but actually it's also collapsing and creating new crevasses and new depths can appear, but also thinking about how, whilst in more urban contexts there is so much change, and places become almost unrecognisable, but still the height of the land, whether it's on a spur, that remains. The rivers, they can be diverted to a certain extent, but their paths still inform the way that roads go. So looking out into the ages, there is still that connection, even if all the houses have completely gone, or the trees have gone, or the different aspects have gone. There's still so much that does connect if you look out, I think. So I'm kind of interested in how you're both, and by you both, I mean all of you, are both looking out and looking in. So at that real minutiae and that absolute macro, the micro and the macro. Róisín, I'd love to hear more about your thought about surfaces and the way that Marie was talking about taking something into being in one plane, because you are drawing depth, but it is ultimately a 2D medium that you're working with. How do you approach that, and what do you think about?
So I suppose initially, if you were to look at the history of artefact illustration, when archaeology as such started, it was started by historians, and it was almost a hobby pursuit for people who had the money to go abroad and look into sort of local stories and myths and legends and try and see if they could find truths to things and bring back these artifacts from countries. So a lot of the early artifact illustration was more like a catalogue of beautiful objects. So they were drawn quite artistically in 3D, but again, capturing a beautiful detail, which they were engravings. So there was a lot of detail in them and form. But again, you're putting it in black and white on paper. So within the artifact itself, you're now not giving enough information. So they were just a beautiful image to look at. But if you can't hold the object, just seeing, and all you're looking at is a drawing on the paper, you need as much information from the artifact as possible, so that when the way they're done now is we take like multiple views of the object and then sections through the object where we're measuring the thickness of the object all the way down, and you show a section through it to one side of the object. you're showing like the top and the bottom. So they're more like technical drawings that you'd see for architecture in a way. And then you always have the light coming from the top left-hand corner. There's certain standards that you'd always adhere to. So I suppose for me, and I do them digitally as well as by hand. So for me, I think I get so absorbed in capturing the essence of the object that for me to have it on a flat surface, then when you have the 3D object in front of you, is okay for me. I have all I need to know about that object. The drawing is now speaking in its own voice about the object and about the information that you need to understand the object. So the drawing in itself now becomes nearly a new piece because it's not going to look like these ancient artifact illustrations where it's a beautiful drawing of the object and you'd only ever get one view, one angle, of the artifact. So you'd never know what it looked like from behind or from the side a lot of the time. So in a way, I think my drawings become a new work based on the artifact itself. It's something that's giving you information about it, but then has progressed into being something in its own entity then as well.
It's just really interesting.
I have a little thing that is just coming to mind hearing Róisín speak and hearing Marie speak. So I grew up in the same house from when I was 7, and it got demolished about 6 or 7 years ago. And in the time that I lived in that house, there were a couple of rooms added on, and the internal layout was changed a couple of times as children got older and rooms got repurposed and all of that. So when the house was being demolished, I went to see it, and it was kind of, the walls were still standing a few feet. It was being torn apart in quite a methodical way. So when I went to see it, all of the different footprints of the house over time were visible at the same time. And it was such an interesting experience. Like my body knew every layout. And at the same time, layers, this is where you discover that they just wallpapered over wallpaper over wallpaper. Nobody ever took wallpaper off. So you could see like the decor across different eras. So in a way, it just makes me think about this is like the meeting point between thinking in terms of a geological lens and thinking in terms of an archaeological lens. And, there were a few objects scattered around as well that remained in the house. So it's just so interesting that like this is the reality. We are always living in all of these different moments of time at the same time. We're always living in this context. It's just that it's usually not visible to us. And it just strikes me that we're all in different ways looking for a lens that allows us to see the compression of time all in one place before our eyes.
Yeah, I love that, Megan, actually, as well. And I have to say, in the last 2 years, I've lost a godmother that I was looking after, and I had to wrap up her house for her. She always apologized and said, "I'm sorry, Róisín, I'm leaving the contents of my house to you." And I went, "Thanks a lot." And the house was teeming with contents. But it was really what really caught my attention. And then my father passed away, so we've been dealing with his pieces as well in the house and property that, we're letting go of. And when you look at everyone's belongings as well, that they carry with them through life and put such meaning into, and they are modern artifacts because like that person's touched those artifacts, there are value of them for some reason. When it's modern artifacts, I suppose the value and the importance of them to me is the same as if it's an ancient one, because in the ancient past, that object meant an awful lot to the person who made it as well. It's more ancient, it's an ancient civilization. But I find it fascinating about modern artifacts in that sense, where it's this legacy that we leave behind when we go. And it's just something I'm still kind of churning over in my head just from everything I've been going through and having to repurpose or rehome so many objects and then seeing the property itself and letting it go. We had a very old cottage in Cork that we're letting go now, but we went down at the weekend and we buried. So this again is where the land comes in again, that we're always entrusting things to the land, I think, at the end of our time or during our time, or like if you consider time capsules that we're putting things in from now so that people later can bear witness to how we've lived now. We have this constant connection going all along through time, and we're always, I think, as a human race, fascinated by it. But we also buried a hammer to signify my father's work that he did on the cottage with a note in the earth by the hawthorn tree in the garden, because we thought no one will touch the hawthorn tree because they'll be too superstitious. So it might be safe there for a few years. But again, it's that notion of just entrusting to the land and And yes, like the lives we're living now, even now, we're like modern history in the making, and all our objects will become artifacts of the future. So it's constantly, there's just that seamless thread, which brings me back to kind of Marie, the way you're working as well, that consistency through and carrying through time is just, it's fascinating. I mean, your mind just keeps going around all these concepts and ideas.
Róisín, do you ever feel compelled to draw any of the, I love that you call them modern artifacts, like your father's hammer or anything like that? Do you ever illustrate
Yes.
those?
Yeah, I haven't as yet, but I have. Well, I did start on teapots that my godmother had because I found that fascinating as an artifact in itself because she had some old ones that you wouldn't really see now. And then there was one that when it was just after the war, as it was always referred to, kind of around the 40s, and tea was scarce. There was always this little tin teapot that was used by, she remembers her granny using it, or her granny using it, and that the tea would be really watery in it and things like that, because the tea was, it was rationed. So the objects like that I found fascinating because they were bringing people together, like the teapot, and then the history behind the stories behind those as well. It's fascinating drawing modern objects, I think. That's why I really, Marie, when you contacted me and reached out, and I suddenly thought of this, that's my first kind of wow, oh yeah, you could draw these modern pieces, these modern forms in this way. And it's fascinating because you're really looking into how people are making things and the meaning of that object that it has to them now. I don't know where it's all going to lead, but it is a fascinating journey in the meantime. So thanks, Marie.
Yeah, like it's amazing the way when you look closely enough at an object, like a landscape kind of emerges. Or like when you really zoom in, you can kind of find a topography on the surface that is, it's so interesting. And I love that image you described of the hammer that's buried and the teapot as well. Like these objects, they kind of have an ontology of their own, particularly tools. I think like the hammer is such an interesting object because it's kind of designed for making human action on the world, and it's for like changing the shape of the world in a sense. But also an object like that can kind of collect residues and marks and itself become this kind of historical artifact of its own action. So there's a kind of circularity there that I think is really interesting, and it kind of decenters the human in a sense because the object itself, it's kind of coming back to what we said in the beginning, it takes on its own agency. Yeah, I think it's so much there. It's so interesting.
Though it's a real privilege to join your conversation today and leads to so many more questions. And I hope we get the opportunity to speak to you all another time. Thank you again to our speakers, Marie Farrington, Megan Macedo and Róisín O Meadhra, and to our funders, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council, Garfield Weston Foundation and Jerwood Foundation. Diagonal Acts is supported by the Arts Council Ireland, Culture Ireland and Wicklow County Arts Office. And you can read more about our speakers and find various links in the description of this podcast and at ccadld.org. Thank you for listening.